Welcome everybody to Constellations Conversations with Nicola Dunn and me, Rowland Smith. Nice to see you, Nicola.
Hello, Robert.
We said we'd take the topic today of after the constellation, which I think will allow us all sorts of opportunities to reflect on when a constellation ends, what to do with it as a constellator, what to do with it as an issue holder, whether there is any feedback afterwards from the constellation, what the impact is in the real world, whether there is any discernible benefit that's been gained, or even the opposite, which is a possibility I guess we should look at, including, I guess, ideas of how to follow up with a client, if at all, what further support they might need, aftercare, to use that term, and maybe some of the more mysterious effects that can sometimes come around after a constellation, when we hear as constellators of things that have happened in the world that seem to go a little bit beyond serendipity or even synchronicity, where a constellation does seem to reverberate it and change things at a distance. So that's kind of scope of our conversation today. But tell me, when you think of this phrase, after the constellation, Nicola, what comes to mind to you?
Well, I think it has two elements to it, at the very least. One is, if it's in a workshop situation, the client, issue holder, seeker, in that workshop, in the course of the rest of the day. So you do get to be in resonance with someone who's done a piece of work, as we describe it, and have a sense of the flow of what might be happening with them a little bit before you kind of part company. And then there is the wider expanse of time. And sometimes one hears nothing from, sometimes one has an ongoing relationship, as I might often do with people who've come for a constellation. And other times people write to you and tell you about things, which is, often amazing. I mean, I've also had a situation of, I used to do some work in Greece and sitting in a restaurant with some friends, and suddenly a woman rushes up and holding a beautiful little toddler, saying, "This is the baby that I wanted to have, that you helped me with. Was so delightful, unexpected, delightful, and joyous." So there are all kinds of sort of possibilities of feedback that happen, and it's an interesting, I think, space or challenge or task for the constellator of how attached it's helpful to be to a positive income or any or outcome for any sort of issue holder who's done a piece of work. And I think sometimes I have to look at myself and say, okay, what was in it for you at that point that you so want things to go well for the issue holder? I think just a little run around myself to see what is mine and what is completely theirs.
Yeah,
you've had a similar experience.
Yes, no, I have, and of course, my vanity knows no bounds, so I'm always wrapped up in it in that way. But just going back a sec, actually, because I like a lot the distinction you made between the after the constellation in the room and the after the constellation once you've parted company, as you say, outside the room. So just in the room, I'll start with that maybe before we go on to those wider topics. I don't know how common this is among constellators, but I'm quite strict about not allowing debrief in the room after a constellation. I used to do that, and I've gone off it completely, and I haven't done it now for years. So when a constellation ends, that's it. I will check in with the issue holder privately. I'll take them aside, just check they're okay. But what I don't allow is any afters in the circle. And maybe I'm overly strict on this, but I'll give you my reason why, because you might do it a bit differently. My reasons for doing that are, when I have done it, and certainly when I've seen it, the conversation quite quickly devolves into something not particularly constellations-y. It becomes a bit of a free-for-all where people are chipping in their views and reverting to as it were, ordinary language, the kind of language you might hear around, you know, the dinner table or something like that. And for me, that spoils a bit of the tone. And secondly, I think it threatens to confuse, unsettle, or distort what the issue holder might be taking from the constellation. And thirdly, because I think it's pretty tender place, I think, for an issue holder to arrive in after a constellation. I mean, sometimes it's fun and joyous, but often it's quite tender. And my instinct is actually in the moment to protect them from all of that. So that's the first thing I'd say about after the constellation in the workshops I do, which is, you know, once it's done, and we don't get into a sort of free-for-all amateur therapy session.
I mean, I just want to say I absolutely agree with you, because I don't go into that either. Sometimes, to be honest, if we have gone to a very deep place and it's particularly tender, you know, we may often have a what they call biobreak, and I sometimes ask the group to remain in silence.
Oh, that's nice.
Feels appropriately reverential for what the person has shared, how they have allowed themselves to be vulnerable in front of the group. I will have set up in the beginning, and I use, you know, sort of almost cartoon-like language in order to press the point. I'll often say, please, when someone, our Constellations hygiene is that when someone has worked, that you don't rush up to them in the break. And I use the word, I say, slobber all over them. Because to press it in, I said, you know, because that's your saliva in a sense, with you telling them about how their situation is exactly like your sister or your uncle or whoever. And I understand the passion in that to connect, but it's actually not necessarily therapeutically helpful.
Yeah.
For the seeker at that moment.
Yeah. I was thinking, is there an exception to this? Because sometimes immediately after the constellation, people sit down, one of the people who's represented in the constellation will be very keen to add some extra information.
Yes.
And I'm slightly in two minds about that, actually, because sometimes it's a bit helpful, but other times they're just still in role, essentially, and they're lobbying or reasserting their point, you know. So on balance, even that, I tend to say thank you, but now let's move on, kind of thing.
Well, I agree with you. From a practitioner's point of view, it's a risk.
Yeah.
Because they say, I've got something I want to say. So there's often a lot of passion behind it. You know, the role takes a few moments to kind of recede and drain almost back into the earth. So you may get a comment, which, as you say, is lobbying for the position of, and for the innocence of that family member. And my main question, I'm balancing both, like you. I'm balancing the need of the representative to say that versus, is this going to be helpful to the issue holder or seeker? So to be honest, sometimes I just take a moment and I just sense myself and just either say yes or no. Because like a little bit like you're describing, I feel my responsibilities lie with the person who has just done their constellation. I'm very happy for that representative to speak to me in the break, something in the break, and then I can get a sense of, it's just a sense of a ball is going to be lobbed right into the middle, and is it going to sort of helpfully bounce some new insight, or is it going to shatter something?
Yeah, exactly. Very well put. And it is a risk, as you say, and I suppose on balance, I'm a bit risk averse because I have seen it be not particularly more unhelpful than helpful, generally speaking.
And I don't know from your own experience, I would say from my experience, even someone saying to me when I've done a constellation, you know, in the past, even someone saying to me with a little bit of tone, did you find that helpful? Already impacts something. I don't want to hear that, because I feel that's their experience, and it is slightly changing the shape of my field I feel a little bit dented by it. So I can only go on that experience from myself as a visceral experience of comments afterwards. I've never found them helpful.
No, and it reminds me, there's another category. I had this beginning of this year with a woman who's very new to constellation. I think it was her first ever constellation. She didn't participate in the first constellation. She just observed. But she obviously identified quite strongly with the issue holder. And essentially at the end, you know, we all sat down, we're ready to move on, when she piped up and said something along the lines of, but it wasn't like that. She's clearly suffering from X. You know, why did you deal with it like Y, Robert? You know, because you know, that the risk there, I think, was she hadn't been dunked in the constellation herself, and so was just hanging on to her. I mean, it's fine for people to be skeptical, of course, but it was, again, sort of changed the dynamic. And that was less about my ego in that case. It was more about, you're just taking us back to square one here, you know. So I think that's another reason, I suppose, why I'm a bit chary of those things.
Yes. So it's, and I'm sure you do the same. I do get if a comment is very pressing, I will get them to address me. I don't want them to address the person who's just work, just because the energy, sort of the initial impact, I'll take it. And I think that in, you know, what way is it helpful? I think it's useful if you decide you're going to have an open, you know, conversation afterwards, that you ask everyone to really check in. Is this going to be helpful for the seeker or issue holder? You know, it's like I often describe that I have all kinds of comments running through my head, and sometimes I ask my inner voice quite frequently, you know, should I say this now? Mostly I get the answer no. So 90% of what is running through me is not helpful for someone else.
No, probably a general rule in life for all of us.
Exactly. So I swallow my own comments at that point.
Yeah.
So yes, so I think our first, you know, it's do no harm, isn't it? Do no harm. We should hold it before the constellation. Do no harm after the constellation.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said. Actually, you know, I love the metaphor you used about it taking a second for people for the representation to drain and seep back into the ground. I love the metaphor. But actually, we ought to say something, I think, about de-rolling, because that is an after the constellation moment in the room.
Yeah.
And people who've been to quite a lot of constellations, you know, say every now and then, you know, Robert, I feel like I need to de-roll. And people new to the group go, what the hell's that then? But I think it's just worth touching on and explaining what it is and how it works, just quickly, perhaps. Because if you are a representative in a constellation, usually it does kind of drain quite easily. And it's sort of remarkable how, you know, 1 minute somebody can be a serial killer and the next moment they're just Charlie, you know, and Charlie's fine.
Charlie's vegetarian or vegan, so no serial killer there.
Yeah, exactly. But for some people, they sit down and they're still burned, and they kind of look it too. And there is a simple process which I use, you use, maybe different constellators vary it a bit, where you invite the issue holder to stand up, and you invite the person who's represented in their constellation to stand up with them. And there's a little ceremony, essentially, where the representative says, you know, I played this role in your constellation, I did so willingly, was very happy to do so, but now I hand it back to you. And the issue holder can say something or just remain silent, but they might just say thank you, and you know, I take it back. And it's surprisingly effective, actually, just that returning, that putting things back in their place, partly because it's a microcosm in a way of what's happening in the wider constellation. We're always trying to put things back where they need to be. But I think it's just worth mentioning that. You might have a slightly different take on it.
Yeah, because they're handing it back to the family system, to the issue holders' wider family system, and I might use that sort of language. I think, there are debates around why someone might feel a little bit that the role has been a little bit sticky for them. And normally the thinking around that is that it's because it has resonance with their own family system. Because at the moment that they sit down, they're no longer representing in the field that particular person, but there may be a resonance that's happened with their own family system, which they either are or are not aware of. And so they feel that there's a little bit of a tail that has remained.
Mm.
And I will give the person a choice. Do you want to just sit with it and be with it, or do you want to be derolled? And then we'll do it.
Mm.
But with you, as you're describing, it's rarer, but I'm happy to do it.
Mm.
And I sometimes, if I've represented, I kind of shake off a little bit like a wet dog as I go towards my chair, because if dogs have done it for centuries, it must be a good thing.
Yeah.
So I feel that somehow that little bit of shaking somehow almost, it's like you shake off a bit of clothing that you can't quite remove in a different way. So I think there are processes you can do, reminding yourself of who you are, and then there's always this last piece. So I think that's quite a nice little aftercare package.
Mm. Yeah, and actually this thing you say about people who carry the representation with them after they've sat down, being touched by something in their family system, that can often come up again at the very end of a workshop, where in the closing round I'll often hear, often enough for I think it almost to be a kind of axiom in constellations, but I'll often hear somebody say, participating or observing so-and-so's constellation resolved something in me too, or gave me an insight that I hadn't had before, or helped me understand something that was a source of confusion for me before. So I think, since we're still in the room after the constellation, that I think is a significant enough phenomenon for us to touch on, because it happens a lot in my experience, probably in yours too, I would imagine.
I'm going to take a slight sidestep,
Mm.
don't forget it, but just to say, I think, one of the things, this probably goes fairly firmly for me in the category of things not to do after a constellation. And that is for the issue holder seeker to go back perhaps to their partner or to their sister and say, oh my God, that constellation showed that, you are doing this, you're doing that, you haven't, sort of, this is sort of sacred information that's coming through.
Mm.
And I don't think that is going to be very therapeutic with any of those relationships, if that is what is said. Because basically, the constellation is for the benefit of the issue holder or seeker, perhaps to take a new or different step, sometimes a slightly more humble position, maybe a more compassionate view about their partner, about their sister. So it's really, that's something which I consider to be that sort of internal, almost cellular for the issue holder or seeker. And then there may be a step that can be made, but it's not using the constellation as a higher authority or, a wet fish to slap somebody with,
Yeah.
It's because that's almost kind of violent in a sense. So in a sense, it's about how can this be therapeutic for our family system? How can I take a step? How can I in a sense, be different in this environment, which makes a change? I don't know if you feel the same about that.
I feel 100% the same, and I'm glad you said it. And I think it's a bit like your do no harm comment. I think it's absolutely critical that people don't use the information from a constellation as a weapon, when they return. Actually, even a positive, what they think might be a positive weapon. Dear mum, I just found out that you had a terrible childhood, and now I feel so terribly sorry for you, and I'm sorry, but blah blah blah. No, the metaphor I use with people is to say, take the resolving images away with you more than what's led up to them. Because if you take away what's led up to them, there's a risk of you just unraveling it all and going back into your pre-constellation mode of overthinking. You know, a lot of people overthink their issues. Focus on the resolving images at the end and sentences, and take, as it were, this is to your metaphor of a kind of cellular like information, take, as it were, an inner photograph of what's happened and carry that with you, because the chances are, just as our behavior in the world generally reflects a kind of inner template we have of how the world works, if you change that inner template, you'll probably change your behavior a bit too. And so it's not up, like as a general rule in life, you can't change other people's behavior, but you can change yourself, and that has an impact on others. And that, I think, that's the message I generally give to people. You know, don't go home and, you know, phone your long lost uncle. Don't necessarily quit your job tomorrow, but take that inner photograph and allow it to repattern the way you see the world. That's how I encourage people to take it away.
I mean, you raise a really great question about what image should you freeze and make your screensaver.
Yeah.
And that is the resolving image. It's not the process of how you got there, because then you're freezing the halfway process. So I think it is that resolving, if we call it the resolving or transforming image, tends to have a lot more freedom in it, a lot more spaciousness, a lot more resource. Often the issue holder or seeker is not as tightly embedded in the ancient bosom of the family. They are in a space in which they have a freedom to really inhabit their own generation, which is an amazing thing. And I think sometimes, as you say, sometimes the issue holder doesn't need to do anything. Sometimes people contact them. I would often have that after a session. I've done a piece of individual work that people will just, open up their phone and suddenly someone, a parent they haven't spoken to for 10 years has just called them from another country. So it's quite amazing sometimes how quickly the rest of the system aligns. And then sometimes there is a conversation. I guess sometimes there is the idea that actually you do need to talk to your partner about this. This issue that you brought, you do need to have a conversation, maybe a deeper conversation. But perhaps they're able to have that conversation from a more wholehearted place that meets the other without judgment. So sometimes there are steps to be taken. Sometimes there are steps that are made towards the issue holder or seeker. So there's a whole other process happening. Yeah.
I mean, this raises perhaps one of the most controversial issues generally about constellations, which is, does it work? And there's still plenty of anti-constellation rhetoric out there that says it's mumbo jumbo, it's pseudoscience, it's manipulation, it's voodoo, it's all the rest of it. I mean, of course, we between us run thousands of constellations and can tell people that that's not the case. But it is, it is a criticism, as particularly for people who haven't witnessed it, and even some who have, for that matter. But this question of the impact of a constellation is tricky, I think, for us. Well, for me, I'll personalize it, because unlike you, I tend to have very few clients, because I do coaching rather than therapy, but I have very few clients I will see one-to-one after a constellation. A few, but not. I think you will have many more than I do. So I don't get to hear much about the impact of a constellation. I will often get an email saying, that was amazing. But in no sort of rigorous scientific or structured way am I getting feedback about constellations and the impact they're having. It's anecdotal, it's ad hoc. I get bits and pieces, I hear every now and then, but I'm not getting anything systematic. And so it is difficult to make any claim, I think, with any real confidence about constellation, or certainly any confidence that would sort of stand up to scientific inquiry. But nevertheless, there's enough I do here that makes me think, yeah, this is shifting things for people. And even if it's not creating an impact in the external world immediately, it is creating or allowing for insight in people that they wouldn't otherwise have got, or has been occluded through their own processes of interpretation. At this constellation I was running last week, a woman came for the very first time to Constellations, and she did an issue, and at the end she basically said, oh my God, though, how did that happen? That is my father, that is my stepfather, that is my, and that is who they are. And now I've seen the essence of them rather than all the cladding I've put around that essence. So, I don't, perhaps that's not a very helpful sort of set of comments, Nicola, but it is something I think as constellators we do run into against, and we do tend to live a bit in a world of the converted rather than the non-converted, perhaps.
Yes. I think there is enough of a swell around constellations that you and I are pretty busy. So as someone said to me who I met somewhere else, whatever, and they asked what I did, and I told them, they said, oh yes, that's really got boots, hasn't it? It could be implying that basically it's been around enough, there are enough practitioners who are good enough that actually there is a movement where it has a place. It has a place, and I'm very happy for everything else to have a place, every other type of therapy, etc. And I guess it's a dialogue really about how all these other therapies, how we all support, support the client really. Then, and are they in competition? If they're in competition, then of course there's going to be sort of aggravation, but maybe that they can actually blend together relatively seamlessly within the client. And then coming to that point, that we've mentioned ourselves before, is that sometimes, and I have this opportunity because I have sometimes these ongoing relationships, and sometimes constellations are not directly credited for some of the movements that happen, though I could articulate pretty clearly what happened in a constellation and then the match movement outside in the person's life. So I think if you're someone who needs, a decent amount of acclaim after doing your work, maybe constellations won't be for you, because that isn't necessary. There's not an ongoing applause, but there can be a kind of deep internal satisfaction when you have the privilege to have some feedback which indicates that something has changed quite dramatically in someone's life. And it's just a kind of quiet inner glow. It's not yours because it was the constellation, but you participated in it. But as I said, it may not be accredited to the constellation.
Yeah. We should probably start winding down in our conversation now, Nicola, but just to add to that, there is that sense of, yes, a little inner glow of satisfaction. I helped a bit in that process. And for me, that goes two ways, really. One is, yes, of course, I'm human. I get a little bit of personal pride and satisfaction from that. But more and more, which is just to prove what an absolute saint I am, I think, goodness me, what an extraordinary gift we've been given as, human beings, not just constellators, to have access to this field and for these extraordinary truths to be able to come to light. So I am, really just, it's funny, the more I do constellations, the more kind of grateful I feel for it, really. It's and the more amazed I am that more people aren't doing more of it. I guess it is just a question of over time things will change, and maybe there is also a question. You said, good constellators, obviously we think we're not bad. I suppose there is a risk that constellations also becomes a bit of a parlor game. I've certainly heard of, you had this memorable phrase in one of our conversations a while back, see one, do one, teach one. The barriers to entry seem pretty low. So there is that risk as well, that it can become a bit of a let's do it down the shopping center, or let's set up a constellation after dinner. Maybe that will go against and impair a bit the sort of excellence of its reputation. But now I'm waffling a bit, but yes, just to say the impact on the person doing the work is often extraordinary, and we take our modest bit of credit for that, but it comes from somewhere in turn.
Yes, and even as you're saying this, Robert, I'm feeling it is a privilege to participate in it, and the constellator is also impacted, and I would say I feel humbled. At the end of a workshop day, I just feel, gosh, humanity are managing so many different sort of problems, issues, challenges. And it feels that at the end of a workshop, what is good for these people who have opened themselves up is good for all of us.
Mm.
So that's the humbling part. So in a sense, it doesn't necessarily feed my ego, but it feeds something else in me that feels small in the face of something very large. But that's a good feeling.
Mm.
It's maybe a moment to conclude.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for watching us. Please check out our websites. You can find Robert at robertrowlandsmith.com and myself at nicoladunnconstellations.com. Do like and subscribe. That motivates us, and we look forward to seeing you again.